All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin with a beautiful daf ahead of us today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Elbaum family, for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month in memory of Cherry Elbaum Yaakov couple, Ben Avram Menachem, by his sons Avron, Sean, and Judah, and by his wonderful wife Shirley Elbaum. May his memory be a blessing and remain eternal in our hearts. And to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Bracha Strimber, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month in loving memory of her husband Avi Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We also thank our week of learning sponsors, the Getz family, in memory of Moshe Chaim's father and mother, Alter Hirsch Ben Binyamin, and Chana Chaya Bas Moshe. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Rabbi Larry and Florence Ziffer, for dedicating the shir this morning in honor of Rabbi Ziffer's mother's yard site, Rachel Bas Meir Yehuda Leib HaKohen. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. We also thank Isaac and Brenda Samuel for dedicating the daf this morning for the Shlema for Esther Bas Vega and Bracha Yenta Bas Chana Rezel. We thank all of our sponsors for their dedication and generosity. And with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Samech Beis 62, and we are picking up, we have a lot to do today actually, we are picking up on Samech Aleph on the Beis 61b. I think we ended off kind of right in the middle of the page. Almost right across from Tosas V'chitema, or Dilma. To go across in Tosas Dilma and go into the Gemara about 4 lines up from there. Mamish smack in the middle of the page. Talmud Lomar Zos. So remember again, we left off in the middle of a question yesterday. And the question was as follows. What happens if you went ahead and you shechted the Karban Pesach, Lamulin, ultimately again for a group of circumcised individuals, Almanas sheyiskapru bo arelim, with the condition, ultimately again, that the arelim, the uncircumcised individuals, achieve atonement. Now, I will say, with this regard, now remember again, Karban Pesach is not an atonement-based offering, but rather what it means is that you are hoping that the uncircumcised individuals would have some level of fulfillment through the Zrika. So what is the impact of that statement? So in the middle of that, Tambalomar Zos. My Zos, Ilema dekula arla pasla, miktsasa lo pasla. So if you say that Zos teaches me that it's only if the Karban Pesach is shechted entirely for a group of Arelim, that it's problematic. But a partial group of Arelim, in other words, a group that includes Arelim and Nimulim, it's not problematic. Hi, mivikol orel nafka. So we'll say that I can learn out from the phrase kol orel. Elalav hochi katani. Rather, this is what it must mean. So the Gemara says, Tambalomar v'chol orel, kula arla pasla, miktsasala pasla. Only time that orel is going to pose a problem is halacha l'maisa, when it's an entire chabura, an entire group of arelim. But if it's some arelim, some nimulim, that is not going to be a problem. V'chitema huadin l'zrika. I say maybe you'll say again that the same idea is for zrika. Tekula arla mia pasla, that it's only if you have in mind by zrika the entire chevra, that they're all arelim, that's when it's problematic. Talmud lomar zos. Therefore, the pasuk says zos b'shchita hu dekula arla mia pasla. It's only by shchita that if you have in mind for an entire chevra of arelim that it is problematic. Aval zrika afilu kula arla namila pasla. But by zrika, even ultimately, again, if it's kula arla, an entire group of entire chevra of arelim, it does not passel. So the Gemara says, "V'chiteimha my kula d'zrika." Why would zrika be more kal than shchita? Right? I will say, see what's happening over here. So you're telling me again, if you have kula arelim by shchita, so the carbon is passel. Kula arelim by zrika, the carbon is not passel. So what's going on over here? The imachshavas ochlin b'zrika. I will say this is a different issue. It's actually quite interesting that halacha l'maisa, having kavana for the wrong group of people to eat the Karban Pesach, or to eat a carbon by zrika, does not invalidate the carbon. Interesting. Rav Chisda will posit, Adirabah, he'll say just the opposite. Lidach gisa, Talmud lomar v'chol orel. The pasuk says v'chol orel, kula orla pasla. It is only if the entire chabura, the entire group are made up of arelim, that they passel the carbon. Miktsasa lo pasla. But part of a group of part of a group comprised of arelim, or if part of the group is comprised of arelim, they do not passel. Aval zrika, that's by shchita. However, by zrika, afilu miktsasa nami pasla. But by zrika, if you have in mind even for a few of the group who are arelim, that will invalidate the carbon. V'chitema hu adin l'zrika da'adiika kula arla lo pasla. You might have thought maybe why should zrika be different by shchita? And just like by shchita, it's only problematic if you have in mind for an entire chabura of arelim. So too by zrika, Talmud lomar zos shchita. Hu de miktsasa lo pasla aval zrika afilu miktsasa pasla. It is only by shchita ultimately that in order to pass the carbon, you have to have in mind for an entire chabura. But Allah l'maisa by zrika, even if it's part of the chabur that are arelim, ultimately invalidates the carbon. My chumri de zrika. Why would you say that zrika is more chamer than shchita? Very simply, the Gemara says, because you see certain invalidations. Like, for example, pigul. We'll say pigul is when a person has intention to eat carbon outside of the prescribed time, or outside of the prescribed place for that matter. Halacha l'maisa, pigul is only affected during zrika. Okay? Maskef l'Ravashi. Mimai dehai v'chol arel kula mashma. So we'll say Ravashi says like this. How do you know that the phrase v'chol arel refers to a chabura that is totally made up of arelim? Dilma hai v'chol arel mashma kol duhu arla. Maybe chol arel means if you have any number of arelim as part of the chabura, the carbon should be invalid. Ksiv rachmana, kol duhu, v'chol arel mashma. Let me read that again. Masker Rashi, Mimai dehai v'chol arel kula mashma, Dilma hai v'chol arel mashma kol duhu arla. Kasav rachmana zos. Therefore, the pasuk says zos da'adiika kula arla lo pasla, lo shna b'shchita, lo shna b'zrika. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says zos, which teaches me the only time that arelim will invalidate the carbon is when it is an entire chabura of arelim, and that is true both by shchita and both by zrika. Ela Amar Ravashi, Rav Chisda v'Rabba. Rabbi say top of Samech Beis Bahai Kra Kamifligi. Rather, Rabbi say the Machlokes Rabba and Rav Chisda centers around the following pasuk: V'nir Salo lechaper alav. The pasuk says it shall be accepted for him to atone for him. Alav v'lo al chavero. So we'll say that teaches me that halacha l'maisa, when you offer up a carbon for a particular individual, and the carbon is being offered for someone, the carbon only affects atonement for the individual for whom it is being offered, and not for quote-unquote his friend, which means you can't offer up a carbon on behalf of someone other than the owner. So the Gemara says, Rabbi say, watch this. Rabbi Savar, which again, it's just a straightforward halacha, right? A carbon has to be offered up for its bailim, for its owner. And halacha l'maisa, if you try to offer it up for someone other than the owner, the carbon does not work. So we'll say second line down from the top, Samech Beis Amadal of 62a. So Rabbi Savar Chavero Dum Yadidei. So Rabbi says, let's just play this out. So I have a carbon, I'm a Kohen, and the Reuven is bringing the carbon. And when I go ahead and I offer up the carbon, I have in mind to offer it on behalf of Shimon. What's the status of the carbon? Status of the carbon? Puzzle. Right? You can't offer a carbon up for someone other than the owner. So we'll say, watch this. So Rabbi Savar, should we read Rashi? Yeah, fine. Rabbi Savar, Chavero Dum Yedidei. Rabbi says the only time that a carbon is invalidated if you offer it up on behalf of someone other than its intended owner is if the second person is similar to the owner. What does that mean? Mahu debar kapara, af chaveru debar kapara. Just as I am, so to speak, shayach, literally bar kapara means capable of achieving atonement through the carbon, so to my friend is capable of achieving atonement through the carbon. La fuke hai orel the lav bar kaparahu. This comes to exclude an orel by carbon pesach, that he is not subject to the carbon pesach. So let me explain Rabbi Shita for just a moment. This is actually quite interesting. So remember, we're talking over here about the psul of shinui bailim, which we've learned about extensively already. Shinui bailim means you offer up the carbon for someone other than its intended owner. Rabbi says the only time that shinui invalidates, that change of ownership invalidates the carbon, is when the person you are substituting technically could have offered up this same type of carbon. So, for example, Reuven's bringing a carbon, Reuven's bringing a shlamim, and the Kohen has in mind for Shimon. Now, Shimon could have also brought a shlamim, but if this happens, the Reuven shlamim, that's called shinui bailim. That's called offering it up for the wrong owner, and that ultimately, again, will invalidate the carbon. But I will say, what happens if the substitute owner, so to speak, right, the second guy you have in mind for, couldn't bring this carbon? Rabba holds that's not called the psul of shinui bailim. Where does this come over? I will say, this is our case. Well, it's our case. I'm shechting the carbon Pesach for a chabura of nimulim, of circumcised individuals, but I have in mind that it should also be good for the areilim, for the uncircumcised individuals. Remember again, Rabba said the carbon is totally kosher. But isn't that shinui bailim? Isn't that changing the owners? To which Rabba will say, no. Why isn't it shinui bailim? Will say, why? Because areilim, uncircumcised individuals, cannot eat the carbon Pesach. So remember, the only time that shinui bailim works is when the replacement owners, so to speak, could have just as much of a portion on the carbon as the actual owners. For Rav Chisda Savar, Hai Aronami Kevan de Bar Chiyuvahu, Kabar Kaparu. Rav Chisda says that's not true. An oral is chayiv in carbon Pesach. He is chayiv in carbon Pesach. Hoil di ibai mitaki nafshe. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rav Chisda says, no. An oral can't eat carbon Pesach. But Rabbi will say, is he chayiv in carbon Pesach? Is he chayiv? Absolutely. And in fact, the only thing blocking him from participating is what? His circumcision. So if he were to circumcise himself, or not literally circumcised, but if he were to become circumcised, then halacha l'maisa, he'd be permitted to partake of the carbon Pesach. So Rav Chisda says, hoil, since if he were to have a bris milah, he would be fit to partake of the carbon Pesach. Therefore, if you have him in mind, that is called shinui bailim. So I will say, this is now a very interesting reinterpretation, ultimately, again, of the machlokes. So remember, we're still focused on the same case, which is, you shechted the carbon Pesach for a group of nimulin, for a chabura of circumcised individuals, but you had in mind that the zrika should achieve some level of atonement for a group of areilim. Is the carbon Pesach kosher or not? Rabba will say, now again, so now the Gemara is suggesting this is a shaila of shinui bailim. This is now a shaila of, have you swapped ownership? Right? Have you substituted secondary owners for the real owners, which is normally an invalidation for a carbon. Rabba says the only time you are in violation of shinui bailim is when the quote-unquote replacement owners are just as fit to offer up the carbon as the original owners. Therefore, in this case over here, there's no shinui bailim. Why? Because the areilim are not fit to participate in carbon Pesach. Rav Chisda says it is shinui bailim. Why? Because at the end of the day, hoil, since if the areilim wanted to do a bris milah, they could do so. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, they're technically viewed as if they could participate in carbon Pesach. Actually, they can now. But hoil, since if they were to do something, quote unquote, an action, they could remedy their situation. They could participate. Therefore, it's called a valid shinui bailim. Good. So we'll say, the Gemara says, 1 second. Umi isle Rav Chisda hoil. We'll say, does Rav Chisda subscribe to the concept of hoil? Remember, the concept of hoil says, since this could happen, therefore review the situation essentially as if it did happen. So essentially over here, Rav Chisda is saying, since the areilim could get a bris milah, therefore they're considered to be technically fit for carbon Pesach, and therefore if you substitute the areilim for the nimulim, it's shinui bailim. But does Rav Chisda subscribe to the concept of hoil? We'll say, after all we learned, here we go. We had this case a little while ago. Both listen to this. Let's say now you bake on Yom Tiv for the weekday, right? So we'll say it's next Yom Tiv, it's Pesach, and you go ahead and you bake on Pesach you cook on Pesach for Chalamayid, or you cook on the last days of Pesach for the weekday. So what's the halacha? So what's the Rav Chisda Amar Loke? Rav Chisda says you get malchus. Rabbi said, of course you get malchus, meaning you're not allowed to, remember, the license for Ochel Nefesh, the license to cook on Yom Tiv, is only for Yom Tiv preparations themselves. You can't cook from Yom Tiv to during the week. So Rav Chisda says, if you do so, you get malchus. Rabbi Amar Eina Loka. Rabbi says, no, you don't get malchus. And Rabbi say, what's the machlokes? Here we go. Rabbi Amar Eina Loka. Rabbi says you don't get malchus. Aminan Hoil v'mikloile orchim chazile. Hashtanami chazile. Because when you cook on Yom Tiv, Rabbi says, there's always the possibility that what? Guests may come over. So whenever you cook on Yom Tiv, Rabbi say, the issue over here is cooking from Yom Tiv to the weekday. Well, maybe guests will come over on Yom Tiv, right? Maybe guests will come over, and therefore the food that you cooked on Yom Tiv will in fact be fit for Yom Tiv use. Chazile, hashtanami chazile. We'll say this is the concept of hoil. The concept of hoil says that since something could potentially be fit for use on Yom Tiv, therefore again it's mutter. Hoil, since guests may come, fine. The Gemara says velola, and therefore velolaki. Rav Chisda Amar Loke. Rav Chisda says you do get malchus. Why? Lo amrinan hoil. We do not subscribe to the concept of. So we'll say, see, now we have a two-pronged machlokes. We have a shaila ultimately again of Rabba on Rabba and Rav Chisda on Rav Chisda. Remember again, so Rabba clearly does not hold. So remember, Rabba does not hold of hoil in the RL case, and Rav Chisda, right? Rav Chisda, let me say it differently. Rav Chisda held by hoil in the RL case, but yet doesn't hold of hoil by the Yom Tov cooking case, and vice versa for Rabba. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Bishlama de Rabba ad Rabba lo kashya. Rabba's sheet is not contradicting himself. Why? Hacha, it will say by Pesach, meaning by the case of the Arel, Muchusar Maisa. See, I will say, Rabba's going to say, you can't tell me that we view an uncircumcised individual like a circumcised individual. That doesn't make sense. That Hoil, since if the Arel were to get a bris milah, he would be a nimal and not an Arel. Therefore, again, we really look at him like circumcised, and therefore it should be shinui bailin. You can't say that. You can't say that. That's not how a Hoil works. So I'll say, otherwise, if you're going to say that, then why is there any classification of arelos at all? Right? So Rabba, well, let me read the next time, then I'll make a little more sense. Hasam, deloma chosr maisa. But I will say, in the case of Yom Tiv, there's no maisa that's like you. See, Rabba will say like this. In the case of Yom Tiv, you have food that you made. You cooked on Yom Tiv. Now, when you cooked on Yom Tiv, your kavana was for what? Was for what? Your kavana was for weekday. Right? That was your kavana. Now Rabba is going to say, but one second, that food could be utilized for guests who show up on Yom Tiv itself. Can be utilized on Yom Tiv. Rabba says, the food's there. The food's there. Now I could say, Hoil just says, once something is present, Hoil could say, well, you did it for a certain set of circumstances, another set of circumstances may arise. But Hoil cannot allow you to defy reality. So if somebody is an Arel, to say that since if they were to get a bris milah, they'd be a nimal, so now treat them like animals, no. That Hoil doesn't work for. Elo Rav Chisda kasha. What do you do about Rav Chisda? Amri ki lesle Rav Chisda hoil lekula lechumra istay. Both is very interesting. Perhaps Rav Chisda only holds of the concept of hoil lechumra, but ultimately again lekula he does not. So therefore, I will say in the earlier case, he will hold of hoil because hoil results in a chumra, namely of invalidating the korban Pesach. But by Yom Tiv, where hoil results in a kula, which will allow you to consume the food and not go ahead and get malchus, Rav Chisda does not subscribe to the concept of hoil. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. Amar le marzutra beid Rav Mari the Ravina. Katani, so we'll say, again, I just want to point out, we're still in the same case. Katani hoil va'arla poseles, v'tuma poseles. So we'll remember again in yesterday's daf, we were trying to figure out again a comparison between arelus and other disqualifications. So Marzucha Marzucha Brei Drav Mari says to Ravina, Katani we learned, Hoil va'arla poseles v'tuma poseles, just like arla invalidates, or I should say, shechting the carbon for arelim invalidates. V'tuma poseles, tuma is also posel. Ma tuma lo asa ba mikzas tuma kechol tuma, af arla lo asa mikzas arla kechol. Let's remember again in yesterday's daf we were trying to figure out if you have a chabura and in that chabura are arelim. What does the presence of the arelim do to the Karban Pesach? So one of the comparisons we made was, well, let's compare Arla to Tumah. Both say, what's the halacha if you have a Chabura, and some of the members of the Chabura are Tamei, some of the members of the Chabura are Tahar? What's the status of that Karban Pesach? What's the status? It's kosher. We saw that in the Mishnah, right? Because the presence of some Tameim in the Chabura does not invalidate the Chabura. So the Gemara wants to just so too by Arelim. If you have some Arelim, some Nimulim, some circumcised, some uncircumcised, the presence of the Arelim should not go ahead and ruin the carbon for everyone else. So the Gemara says, Hai Tuma Heichi Dami. What's the case of Tuma that you're referring to over here? Tumas Gavri. If you want to say that, as we've thought until now, that we're talking about a Chabura, where some of the guys are Tameh and some of the guys are Tahar. Umaylo also about mixas tuma kechol tuma, and we'll say, what does it mean that we don't make partial tuma like full tuma? Very simply, the iika arba v'chamisha garvi tmein, the arba v'chamisha garvi tahorin lo pasli lahu tmein letahorin. So we'll say, and then v'pashos, what it means is as follows: if you have 10 guys in the chabura and 5 are tamei and 5 are tahar, the presence of the 5 who are tamei does not invalidate the carbon for those who are tahar. If that's the case, Gabe Arla Nami, Halo Pasli. So we'll say that would be the same thing by Arla. After all, we learned this nan, Lamulin Villa Arelim Kosher. Then we'll say if you shech the carbon Pesach, right, and you have shechted for a Chabura, and the Chabura has 10 guys, 5 are Nimol and 5 are Arel, the Mishnah said pretty explicitly that what? The carbon is kosher. So Maishna Tuma de Pshitale, or Maishna Arla de Mesafkale. So we'll say, why is it that the Gemara is totally sure about this halacha by Tuma, but not totally sure about it by Arla? It's the same halacha. Ella betumas basar. Oh, we'll say, listen to this. Says the Gemara, when we talk about the case of Tumah, it's not as we thought it until now. Well, at least that's the Gemara is going to say right now. Up until now, we thought the case of Tumah, we'll say, was people who are Tameh. And the case, therefore, is, I have a Chabura of 10 guys, 5 are Tameh, 5 are Tahar, so halacha l'maisa, the presence of the Tameim does not go ahead and ruin it for the Tahar. Now the Gemara says, no, that's not the case. The Tumah we're talking about is Tumah's Basar. The meat itself became tamei. So watch this. Umaylo asuba mixas tuma kechala tuma. So what does it mean that we don't make partial tuma like complete tuma? Here we go. Dilu itni chad me'ivarim hay di itni sarfina lei v'idach achlina lei. We'll say, what's the case? Where if part of the carbonic meat, one of the limbs of the carbon, becomes tamei, we don't say that once one limb becomes tamei, that the entire carbon becomes tamei. Rather, we burn the limb that has become tamei, and the rest of the carbon is fit for use. We'll call it carbonic use. So the Gemara says, okay. So the Gemara says, "B'mayo kimte b'tumas basar." So now you're setting up this case as talking about that the tumah being referred to over here as tumah of the sacrificial meat. Ema seifa. Yet look at the seifa. Done in davar she'ino noeg b'chal zvachim, mi davar she'ino noeg b'chal zvachim. That we go out and we compare something that does not apply by all karbanos to something that does not apply to all karbanos. And don't compare it to zman, the invalidation time. Also remember again, this is yesterday when we were trying to figure out, should we learn out the concept of arelos? Should we learn it out from Tumah, or should we learn it out from zman? To which the Gemara, remember this was yesterday's daf, to which the Gemara pointed out, well, here's the problem. Tumah and arelos don't apply in any other carbon other than carbon Pesach. Right? Also remember, we saw this yesterday. Any other carbon, if you're uncircumcised, you could offer up a carbon. You could offer it up. If you're tamei, you could appoint a shaliach, and that shaliach can bring the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash on your behalf. That's not a problem. It's only by carbon Pesach versus zman. Zman, I will say, right? Offering up the carbon with some type of time invalidation, that applies to all karbanos. To which the Gemara says, Umay Tuma, what Tuma are you referring to over here? Again, Imema Tumas Basar, if you're saying that the sacrificial meat itself became Tamei, that applies to every single carbon. Elapshita Betumas Gavri. Rather, once again, let's go back to what we originally thought. That Tuma is not referring to the Tuma of the sacrificial meat. Rather, Tuma is referring to what? Tuma of the individuals. To which the Gemara says, Umay inunoi b'chol hazvachim. And what does it mean when we say that Tumah doesn't apply to any other carbon except carbon Pesach? Oh, I'll tell you what it means. Dilu b'chol hazvachim aril v'tamei mishachin carbon oseyan. But say by any other carbon, if somebody is tamei or someone is an arel, they have every right and ability to offer up a carbon. In other words, we'll say you can't walk into the Beis Hamikdash, but you can go ahead and have someone else bring your carbon for you. V'ilu b'Pesach aril v'tamei ein mishachin pischayin. But Rabbi say ultimately again by carbon Pesach, if someone is an arel or someone is tamei, they cannot go ahead and offer up a carbon Pesach. So which the Gemara says, well, let me get this straight. Reisha b'tumas basar v'seifa b'tumas gavri. So Rabbi say the way you've set up the Reisha and Seifa is that Tumah refers to two different things. In the Reisha, Tumah refers to the actual Tumah of sacrificial meat. And in the Seifa, Tumah refers to Tumah of the individual. Isn't that strange? Amrlein Shem Tumah Kaparach. He said, no, it's not strange. That ultimately, again, it's true. The word Tumah is a catch-all for all forms of Tumah. But in the Reisha, it's a reference to. In the Reisha, ultimately, it's a reference to the Tumah of the sacrificial meat. And in the Seifa, it's a reference to Tumah of the individual. The other possibility is, Ema Seifa, Seifa Nami B'tumas Basar. Could very well be that the Sefer is also talking about the Tumah of sacrificial meat. And what does it mean then when it says that type of Tumah doesn't apply to all karbanos? That's not true. Every carbon has the capacity to become Tameh. Di'ilo b'chol hazvachim bein shenit machelev v'basar kayim bein shenit ma'basar v'chelev kayim zorik hasadam. Let's listen to this. By all other karbanos, as long as some part of the meat remains tahar, ultimately again you could do zrika. Whether it's the meat that becomes tamei and the chaylev, the fat is tar, or the chaylev becomes tamei and the meat becomes tar, as long as there's some part, some sacrificial remnant that is tar, you could do the zrika. The ilah Pesach, interesting about Karan Pesach, nitma chaylev basar kaim zorik. If ultimately again the chaylev became tamei and the basar is okay, you could do zrika. Zorik es adam. Nitma basar v'chelev kayim eno zorik es adam. But ultimately, again, Karan Pesach will say, if the basar becomes tamei, even if the chelev is still tar, you can't do zrika, which makes sense because remember, the essence of Karan Pesach is what? Consumption of the meat itself. So, how are you setting it up now? But Tumas Basar, you're setting this now up that Tumah refers to Tumah of sacrificial meat. Ema Seifa, done in Davar Shalo Hutter Michlalo, Mi Davar Shalo Hutter Michlalo, Ve'al Tochiach Tumah Shar Hutra Michlala. So we'll say, remember again, what did we say? The Seifa of the Brayz said that we should go ahead and learn something that has no exception from something else that has no exception, which I will say was a reference ultimately again to the concepts of Zman and Arelos, and don't learn it out from, this is just quoting the Brayz from yesterday, but and don't learn out from Tumah, Shei Hutra Michlala, because we'll say there is a case of permitted Tumah. So the Gemara says, B'mai, what's the case of permitted Tumah? Ilema, we'll say, Samech Beis Amud Beis. Ilema B'tumas Basar Heicho Hutra. We'll say, if you say that Tumah refers to Tumas Basar, right? If you say that Tumah refers to Tumas Basar, that literally so we'll say, where is there ever a situation of Tumas Basar where that is permitted? We'll say, once sacrificial meat becomes Tameh, there's no exception to that rule. Elapshita b'Tumas Gavri. Rather, Tumah must refer to over here of what? The individual becoming Tameh. The Heicho Hutra. So we'll say, where is there ever an exception to the rule of personalistic Tumah? To the Gemara says, Heicho Hutra Michlala B'tzibur. We'll say, we will touch on this concept a bit more about the idea of Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. This fascinating idea that if you have a situation, ultimately again of where 51% or more of Klal Yisrael is Tameh, the laws of Tumah essentially are suspended, which means that you'll be able to do the Avodah, certain parts of the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, at least for Karban Pesach. What it would mean is that you would be permitted to go ahead and offer up the Karban Pesach in the state of Tumah. But you should know, interestingly enough, this is one of the, usually the biggest Shaila by Chanukah, right? The biggest Chanukah Shaila is, why is the miracle of Chanukah celebrated for 8 days? After all, again, we know they had a Pach Shemen that had enough oil for 1 day, so there's only 7 days of miracle. Okay, but there's even a bigger Shaila by Chanukah. What's the bigger Shaila by Chanukah? Tumah hutra b'tzibur. That's the big shaila by Chanukah. Right at the end of the day, remember everybody was tamei because there was war. So there was the tzibur, 51% of Klal Yisrael was definitely tamei. So ultimately, again, why do you even have to get into the whole issue regarding ritually pure oil? Tumah hutra b'tzibur. Okay, Meretz, so I'll come back to it before Chanukah. So let's say, so again, the Gemara says as follows: Reisha b'tumas basar, seifa b'tumas gavri. So we'll say the way you're setting this up now is that the first part of the Brayso is talking about Tumah. When it talks about Tumah, is sacrificial meat becoming Tameh. And Seifa is talking about Tumas Kavri, that ultimately the individual is becoming Tameh. So again, the Gemara is bothered by that because then you're setting up, being Tumah just means two different things in two different contexts, right? So in the Reisha means one thing, and the Gemara says, yeah, in Shem Tumah Kaparch, yeah, that's the way it is. Tumah ultimately, again, can mean different things. And again, in one place, Tumah means Tumah of the individual. The other place, it means Tumah of the Basar. The other possibility is Kula Vibais Ima, Kula B'Tumas Basar. The entire Bryce is talking about Tumah of the sacrificial meat. Vehecha Hotra B'Tumas Pesach. This is Vehecha Hotra. And ultimately, again, I will say, where is there ever a case of Tumas Basar that becomes permitted? In other words, I understand the case of Tumas Gavra. There is a case of individual Tumah that becomes tar. That's Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor. But ultimately, again, 51% of Klal Yisrael is Tameh. Tumah, laws of Tumah are suspended. But where do you ever have a case of a piece of sacrificial meat which becomes Tameh, but then is permitted because it is tar? Where do you ever have a case like that? So the Gemara, I'll tell you. Vehecha Hutra B'Tumas Pesach. I'll tell you where it comes up, Rabbi say, where sometimes a situation where the carbon Pesach itself, the meat itself becomes Tameh. What's the case? Tisnan. Listen to this. Ha-Pesach haba b'tumah. If carbon Pesach comes in a state of Tumah, ne'echal b'tumah. Ultimately, again, it can be consumed in a state of Tumah, shalabat mitchilasa ela ba'achila. Because ultimately, again, it only came from the beginning for consumption purposes. I will say, take a look at Rashi, tap Rashi, Samech Beis Mondays, shebitchilasa loba, lo ne'emra hava ikar pesach ela la'achila. V'chishaye rachmana la'asuye b'tumah barov tzibur, kedichsev, ish kiyeh tameh. So we'll say, listen to this. If you have a case, ultimately, again, where the tzibur is tameh, and they bring a carbon pesach in a state of tumah. So we'll say, so effectively, what is the status of that sacrificial meat? What's the status of it? It's tameh. And yet you see that you are permitted to go ahead and consume ritually impure sacrificial meat. So there is a case of tumas basar, where ultimately, again, it can be consumed even in a state of tumah. So therefore, I will say, even if you want to interpret the Brayso as talking about in both cases that halacha l'maisa tumah means tumas basar, you could do so. Massive Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yoshua. So isn't this interesting case? So Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yoshua raises a kasha and he says as follows: Pesach she'avra shnaso v'shachto bizmano l'shmo. Okay, so now watch this case. You have now remember the halacha is, we'll say this is parsha. Karban Pesach could be a goat or it could be a lamb, but it must be within its first year. Within 1 year old, right? Anything older than that has aged out of the Karban Pesach category. So here's the case. You went ahead and let's say last year you designated a newborn animal to go ahead and be our Karban Pesach for the following year. The problem is that by the time Pesach comes along, the animal is more than 1 year old. But nevertheless, you take that animal, v'shachto bizmano l'shmo. You shechted the animal on Erev Pesach for the sake of Karban Pesach. So we'll say, so effectively, you've taken an animal that is too old to serve as Karban Pesach, and you've shechted it l'shem Pesach. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Shavra Shnaso, it's the last of the wide lines on top of Rashi. Shenolad ishtakid, kodim Rosh Chodesh Nisan, ve'frish l'shem Pesach, v'chimata Rosh Chodesh Nisan, v'avra Shnaso, sulo chazi l'Pesach, d'chsiv, zachar ben shana, v'kai l'shlamim. Kai l'shlamim, so we'll say, remember again, what's the status of a Karban Pesach, of an animal you separated or you designated as a Karban Pesach that's now more than 1 year old? Well, it can't be used as a Pesach, but it can be used as a shlamim. Karban shlamim. Okay. So we'll say, so case number one is, I took a Karban Pesach or an animal that's more than 1 year old, I shechted it on Erev Pesach for the sake of Pesach. V'chein, hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach bizmano. Or for that matter, I went ahead and I took other karbanos, and I went ahead and I shechted them for the shame pace. I suppose I designated another shlamim, right? And yet I take that animal on Erev Pesach and I shechted l'shem Pesach. So we'll say, what's the status of these karbanos? Rabbi Eliezer posts. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's possible. It's possible. But Rabbi Yoshua machshir. And Rabbi Yoshua says, ultimately, again, it is kosher. So we'll say, let's analyze this just a moment. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Eliezer posel, Taimam Farsh Parakam Dizvachim Ma Pesach Shem Mosro Ba Shlamim Shachtu L'Shem Shlamim Bizmano Pasol Shlam Shein Mosrin Ba Pesach. So we'll say, so Rabbi Eliezer's sheet is much more intuitive. It's puzzle because you've offered up really an invalid animal. What about Rabbi Yoshua? Rashi, Rabbi Yoshua Machshir T'chol Zvachim Shen Izbachin Shelo Lishman Ksherin Chutz Mi Pesach Echad. So let's analyze. So Taima Bismano. Now the reason ultimately again why this is coming up is because the carbon is being offered up in its appointed time Erev Pesach. Hashalo Bismano kosher. But if it were to be offered up Shalo Bismano, not on Erev Pesach, it would be kosher. Why is that? Bamai. Nema Hoyil Bismano Posel. Shalo Bismano Nami Posel. Why don't we say it the same way? That if these carbonos were offered up during Bismano, Erev Pesach, it would be possible. Shalom Bismano should also be possible. Amar Papa Shiny Hasam the Amar Kra Va'amartem Zevach Pesachu. The pasuk says, "You shall say it is a Zevach Pesachu Bav Yoso Lo Hu L'Shem Achirim V'Lo Achirim L'Shmo." We'll say ultimately again Halacha L'Maisa. There's a difference like Karban Pesach. Papa posits that it says Va'amartem Zevach Pesachu, that ultimately the Karban only works if it's a Karban Pesach being offered up for its own purpose. Lohul L'Shem Achirim, if it's a Pesach being offered up for another purpose, that's invalid, and other Karbanos for Pesach do not work either. Bismano Shu Posta L'Shem Achirim, Achirim Posta L'Shmo. Bismano, both I say in the right time, meaning Erev Pesach, where ultimately, again, if you were to offer the Pesach for the sake of another carbon, it would be invalid. So others can't be offered up l'shem carbon Pesach. Shelo Bismano, but not in its appointed time. Shukashu l'shem achirim, where ultimately, again, the Pesach can be offered up for something else, or as for Shlamim, achirim ksherim l'shmo. Even others offered up for the sake of Pesach will be kosher as well. Beautiful. So we'll say the Gemara now tells a story over here. Rabbi Smaloi asal kamed Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Smaloi came before Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le nisni mar sefer yuchsin. And he said to him, this is Rabbi Smalai speaking to Rabbi Yochanan, teach me the book of yuchsin. They will say now yuchsin literally means what? Genealogies. Teach me the book of yuchsin. So the Gemara says, Amar le, so before we get to that, so Rashi says over here, sefer yuchsin, masnisa de divrei hayom. So we'll say Rashi and Maharsha both understand over here that sefer yuchsin is a reference to the book of Divrei Hayamim, which does contain a lot of chronology and a lot of genealogy. See, so Rabbi Smalai wants Rabbi Yochanan to teach him Sefer Yochsin. Okay. Amar le mehechanat. So Rabbi Yochanan said to him, tell me, Rabbi Smalai, where are you from? Amar le Milud. I'm from the city of Lud. This is Rabbi Smalai talking. Vehechan mosvach. And where do you live now? Ben Naharda. Ultimately, again, I live in Naharda. To which Rabbi Yochanan responds, Amar le Ein nidonin lo leludim v'lo nahardon. We do not go ahead and teach the book of Yuchsin to people from Lud or to people from Narda. The chol shekein da'at milud umot chabanah. Certainly, Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Smaloi, I certainly can't teach you Sefer Yuchsin because you were born in Lud and you live in Narda. The two places that we never teach Sefer Yuchsin to. Now, what's the issue? Rashi says over here, Ein shonen Sefer Yuchsin lo leludim ledachuye echadin. Right? So two possibilities. For some reason, Rabbi Yochanan did not want to teach Rabbi Smaloi Divrei Hayomim or Sefer Yochsin. So Rashi says it wasn't literal that they didn't teach Sefer Divrei Hayomim to people from Narda, people from Lud, but for some reason Rabbi Yochanan was just trying to push Rabbi Smaloi away. So we'll say there's another version in Rashi, and in the second version of Rashi, it could very well be that Sefer Yuchsin is not simply a reference to Divrei Hayamim, but it's actually a reference to some type of book of genealogies. And what Rabbi Yochanan was saying to Rabbi Smalai is, it was apparently known that the people of Lud and the people of Narda, they didn't have such pashat genealogies. Both say, it's amazing. Every once in a while, it's fascinating. Now that they have these DNA kits, you read these stories. It's incredible about like people decided to me, what do they have like these, 21 and I don't know, all these different things. People do these DNA tests and they realize like the wildest things like my father wasn't my father, or like, or I'm related to, how could I be related to 37 other people when, this, and you read these stories. I find it like every Sunday it appears like the Wall Street Journal in their weekend edition seems to print some of these stories, and like you see like people's lives are upended. This whole thing is to see who you're related to, but sometimes it mamish tears apart the fabric of family. Chazal had a concept that mishpako shenitmu nitmu, not with an aleph like tameh, but with an ayin. Family genealogies that are hidden should remain hidden. In other words, sometimes we don't investigate familial background all that much because it uncovers things that maybe are better off remaining covered. There's a concept like this in halacha. In halacha, kind of just leave it alone. Leave it alone. So it could very well, what Rashi is suggesting over here is, apparently it's possible that in Lud and in Arda, maybe there were issues of morality, maybe there was something else, but apparently it was generally felt, don't get into issues of genealogies in these two communities. So Rashi's second version was, Rabbi Yochanan says to Rabbi Ismail, no, not a good idea. I'm not teaching you Sefer Yochsin. Which I both say, by the way, is sometimes a fascinating thing in life, how there's this dialectic about somehow the need to understand and uncover is a good thing, and sometimes the best thing is to leave things alone and focus your kohos, not backwards, but focus your kohos forwards. An interesting dialectic in life. And anyway, the Gemara goes weiter. Kafye ba'artse. So what happened? So finally, again, somehow Rabbi Smalai prevailed upon Rabbi Yochanan to teach him Sefer Yochsin. So Kafye means he forced him, and Rabbi Yochanan became agreeable. Amrle, Nisanye begimel yarche. So now, Rabbi Smalai, so now that Rabbi Yochanan finally agreed, Rabbi Smalai said, fine, listen, we got 3 months. We got 3 months to get through whether it's Tidra Hayomim, Sefer Yochsin, that's all I've got. Shakel kala pasik bey. Rabbi Yochanan took a clod of dirt and he threw it at Rabbi Smalai. And then obviously, action of like get out of here. Get out of here. What are you talking about? He said, Amrle, Uma Bruria, Divisud Rav Meir, Barte Reb Chanina ben Trajan. So we'll say Bruria, who was an exceptional scholar. She was the wife of Rabbi Meir. She was the daughter of Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan. Desanya Tlas Meir Shmaisesa Biyoma, Migimel Meir Abusa. She used to learn 300 halachas a day from 300 teachers. It took her 3 years to learn Sefer Yochsin. Va'at amrit bitlosa yarchi, and you have the chutzpah to say you only have 3 months to learn it. So it's interesting, right? So you see here, somehow Rabbi Smalai got Rabbi Yochanan to agree to teach him Sefer Yochsin, but then when he mentioned the timeline, Rabbi Yochanan lost patience with this individual, threw a cloud of dirt at him, and said, "What are you talking about? You can't learn Sefer Yochsin in 3 months." Fine. So Kishak of others. We'll say Rabbi Smalai is leaving because apparently again Rabbi Yochanan now it's not going to work. It's not a good shidduch. So he's leaving. Kishakel va'azil amrle Rebbe ma bein shmo v'shalol l'shmo la'ochlav v'shalol li'ochlav. So we'll say as Rabbi Smalai is leaving, he figures, you know what? Let me just ask one more shayla from Rabbi Yochanan. I'm leaving. Okay, we're not going to be a chavrusa together, but Rabbi, let me ask you, what's the difference when you offer up a karban? What's the chiluk ultimately again? Bein l'shmo, shalo l'shmo, li'ochlav, and shalo li'ochlav. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi bein ma bein l'shmo, shalo l'shmo, li'ochlav, shalo li'ochlav, ma'ishna de l'shmo, v'shalo l'shmo passer, li'ochlav, shalo li'ochlav passer. We'll say, listen to this. If you shech the karban, l'shmo, v'shalo l'shmo. In other words, you have kavana, let's say, for Pesach and shlamim, right? That invalidates the karban. Yet, if you have a chabura, some of whom are tamei and tar, and you have in mind for the tamei and taorim, then what? The karban is kosher. So why is it shalo and shalo l'shmo is possible, but la'ochlav and shalo li'ochlav is kosher? Amarle hoyel v'tzur mirabanan at ta ve'emelacha. So Rabbi Yochanan said, good kasha. And from your kasha, I can see that you are a Talmud Chacham. Because you're a Talmud Chacham, I'll answer you. L'shmo v'shalo l'shmo psula begufo. Both a kavana, when l'shmo shalo l'shmo is a psul in the actual identity of the carbon. We saw this yesterday. Li'ochlav v'shalo li'ochlav ain't psul begufo. But I will say, when you have in mind for different groups for eating, that's not considered to be a psul in the guf of the carbon. Above here, the distinction there is when you have in mind for different type or categorization of the carbon, that goes to the actual essence of the carbon itself. That is a psul in the actual carbonic identity. Liochlav and shalol liochlav, that's a secondary issue. That doesn't get to the core identity of the carbon. Therefore, even if you have the wrong kavanah, it doesn't go ahead and invalidate the carbon. L'shmo v'shaloshmo, i'af shalavari surah. Furthermore, again, we'll say when you have kavanah l'shmo and shalol l'shmo, you can't identify which part of the carbon is l'shmo, which part of the carbon is not l'shmo. The Gemara said, liochlav v'shalo liochlav, i'af shalavari surah. But when you have kavanah, ultimately, again, liochlav and shalol liochlav, you can identify which is good and which is not good, right? 10 guys in the chavura, 5 are tamei, 5 are tar. You know exactly what is problematic, what is okay. L'shmo v'shalo l'shmo, yeshno b'dalet avodos. Furthermore, again, I will say, the kavana to offer up a carbon, l'shmo and shalo l'shmo, applies to all 4 blood avodos, right? Shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. L'ochlav v'shalo liochlav, eino ba'arba avodos. Ultimately, again, but a psul liochlav, will say, doesn't apply by 4 avodos. For example, we saw this already before, that a psul ochlin does not apply during zrika. L'shmo v'shalo l'shmo, yeshno b'tzibar kibiyachid. A kavanah l'shmo v'shalo l'shmo applies to both communal as well as individual offerings. Liochlav v'shalo liochlav, eino b'tzibar kibiyachid. Both say liochlav v'shalo liochlav doesn't apply to communal offerings, only to individual offerings. Ravashi says, Psula begufa v'yef shalavari. So both say, so these are the 4 distinctions, ultimately again, that Rabbi Yochanan put forward to Rav Smaloi, between the psul of l'shmo and shalol l'shmo, and liochlav and shalol liochlav. The Gemara ends, Ravashi Amar, Psula begufa v'yef shalavari surah chada milsi. Ravashi says just 2 of the 4 are really one. When Rabbi Yochanan said that ultimately l'shmo and shalol l'shmo is a psul begufo, is an invalidation in the inherent carbonic identity. And then the second thing he said is that l'shmo and shalol l'shmo, i'af shalavar isur, you can't differentiate where the isur is and where it's not. Those 2 things are in fact the same thing. Meaning what? Chadamil sihi. The matam amar psula begufo. Why is it that when you have kavanah l'shmo and shalol l'shmo, that's called a psul begufo? That's called a psul, an invalidation in the inherent identity of the carbon. Ultimately, again, says the Gemara, or says Rav Ashi, mishum di efshar levarer isuro. Because you cannot distinguish which part of the carbon is impacted by lishmo and shalol lishmo, therefore the problem envelops the carbon in its identity, and therefore it's possible. So again, I will say, all Rav Ashi is coming along to say is, Rabbi Yochanan, you wanted to put forward 4 distinctions between lishmo and shalol lishmo, and la'ochlav and shalol li'ochlav, but in fact 2 of the ones you mentioned are in fact 1. So we'll say, I'll just end off with the, we don't have time. We'll say, okay, we'll have to Mir Tashem, the one piece that's still outstanding is the actual question that the Gemara started out with, which was halacha l'maisa. If you go ahead and you shecht it for the purpose of the nimulin, but you have in mind ultimately again for the arelim, does that invalidate the carbon or not? That was a machlokes Rav Chisda and Rabba. Rav Chisda said pasul. Ultimately, again, Rabba said kasher. The way we paskin, the Rambam paskin is like Rav Chisda. Then, in fact, kavana for the nimulin, for the arelim, would in fact invalidate the carbon. But we'll discuss it Amirat Hashem in the subsequent topic. Shkar Chabosai.